My husband changed the locks on our family home after 38 years of marriage. So I altered my corporate trust and froze every dollar keeping his law firm alive. My name is Martha Bennett, and I am 64 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. I had spent nearly 4 decades paying the bills, protecting the business, caring for the family, and making sure my husband could stand in front of wealthy clients looking untouchable. But the afternoon I came home from visiting my ailing sister, my key stopped working. A divorce letter was taped to the door, and my husband's attorney had already sent instructions about what I was allowed to remove from the house. I stood on the front step with one suitcase and a folder of medical receipts. I didn't cry. I called a hotel. Then I called my estate attorney. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the first year of my marriage to Richard Bennett began in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Columbus, Ohio. He was 27, ambitious, and convinced he was destined for a courtroom. I was 26, working as a bookkeeper for a manufacturing company and taking night classes in accounting. Richard had a borrowed desk, 2 suits, and a stack of unpaid student loans. What he had was confidence. What I had was the habit of noticing what everyone else overlooked. When Richard decided to open his own law practice, I put my savings into the first office lease. I answered the telephone during my lunch breaks, typed his pleadings after midnight, and learned enough about trust accounting to keep him from losing his license. He called it temporary. "Once I get established, you won't have to work so hard," he promised. The very next month, one of his early clients failed to pay. The rent was due, the lights were about to be disconnected, and Richard spent an entire afternoon rehearsing arguments for a hearing that had nothing to do with our immediate problem. I sold my grandmother's gold bracelet and paid the office bills. Richard kissed my forehead and said, "You're the reason I'm going to make it." I believed him because believing him was easier than asking what would happen if I stopped. Over the next decade, the firm grew. Richard hired associates, moved into a renovated brick building, and began wearing custom suits. I left my bookkeeping job when our son Daniel was born. That decision was presented as practical, but it became permanent. I handled the household, tracked the firm's expenses, reviewed payroll, and prepared the financial reports Richard brought to meetings with investors and lenders. The law firm had a controller, but the controller reported to me. Richard had a business manager, but the business manager asked me which accounts could be used. When a partner threatened to leave because his bonus was late, I found the money. When a malpractice insurer questioned a claim, I organized the records. When Richard forgot a tax deadline, I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning and fixed the paperwork. He called me the back office. At dinner parties, he introduced me as my wife, Martha. If someone asked what I did, Richard usually laughed and said, "She keeps the trains running." Nobody asked whether I was tired. By the time Daniel was in high school, Bennett and Cole had offices in 3 cities. Richard became known for corporate litigation and appeared on local television whenever a major company faced a lawsuit. I watched him speak under bright studio lights while I sat in the kitchen balancing accounts on a yellow legal pad. Our daughter, Claire, had moved to California after college. She called when she needed something, usually advice about a landlord, help with a down payment, or money for a business venture that never quite started. Daniel stayed close to Richard because Richard had made him a junior partner before he had earned the title. I paid Daniel's law school tuition. He never thanked me directly. He sent a text to his father saying, "Got the transfer. Appreciate it." Richard forwarded it to me with a thumbs up emoji. That small symbol became familiar. It appeared after I arranged a mortgage refinance, paid for Claire's wedding reception, or made sure Richard's mother had a home health aide. The bigger my responsibility became, the less visible I seemed. A few days before my 60th birthday, I found Richard's mother sitting alone in her room at the assisted living facility. She had forgotten the date. Richard had promised to visit, but was in Chicago entertaining a client. I brought her a cake, changed the flowers in her vase, and stayed until she fell asleep. When I mentioned it that night, Richard loosened his tie and frowned at me. "You make everything sound like a sacrifice," he said. "I didn't say it was a sacrifice." "You don't have to. It's always there in your voice." I looked at the expensive watch on his wrist. I had bought it for him after he won a case that brought the firm its largest client. "What would you prefer I say?" I asked. Nothing, Martha. Just stop keeping score. The next morning, I deleted the note in my phone where I had recorded the hours I spent driving to his mother's appointments. I also stopped expecting gratitude. That was the beginning of how I survived the marriage. Richard's expectations continued to rise. He wanted a lake house, so I negotiated the purchase and arranged the renovations. He wanted the firm to expand, so I structured a line of credit using assets from my family's investment company as collateral. My grandfather had created that company decades earlier, long before Richard and I met. Its purpose was simple: preserve family wealth and distribute income among descendants. When Richard joined me at the trust office, he treated the attorneys like employees. Without the Bennett family capital, this firm would still be renting a room over a laundromat, I reminded him once. He smiled without looking up from his phone. Technically, you're a Bennett now. That sentence stayed with me because of how casually he said it. Not as a joke, not as affection. As if marriage had transferred ownership of everything I brought into the relationship. The following spring, Richard began traveling more often with a new partner at the firm, a woman named Allison Price. She was 42, polished, and ambitious. At first, Richard said she was simply handling a difficult client. Then Allison started appearing in photographs from firm events, standing beside him with her hand resting lightly on his arm. When I asked whether there was something I should know, Richard looked offended. "You're being insecure." "I'm asking a direct question. And I'm telling you that not every woman who works with me is trying to steal your husband." He walked away before I could answer. The very next morning, the firm's payroll system rejected a transfer. I spent 3 hours locating the error while Richard sat in his office preparing for a television interview. When I finally fixed it, he came out and said, "Good, that's why we keep you around." He intended it as praise. I returned to my desk and signed the wire transfer with a steady hand. The first unmistakable change came in the summer I turned 64. Richard stopped asking when I would return from my sister's house and started asking how long I planned to stay away. My younger sister Elaine had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure. She lived in Pennsylvania, 3 states away, and needed help organizing medications, transportation, and insurance paperwork. I booked a flight for 10 days. Richard barely looked up from his breakfast when I told him. "Daniel can handle the firm while you're gone," he said. "Daniel doesn't know the operating agreements." Then maybe it's time he learned. I left a binder on the dining room table with tabs, passwords, contact numbers, and instructions. I highlighted the accounts that could not be touched without my approval. Richard didn't say goodbye at the airport. He texted me from the car. "Don't extend the trip." Elaine had a fall on the 3rd day. 10 days became 3 weeks. I slept in a recliner beside her hospital bed, spoke with doctors, and argued with an insurance representative who insisted her rehabilitation was unnecessary. Richard called once. "How much longer?" "She can't walk without assistance." "That's unfortunate, but I have a closing next week." The hospital hallway smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. I pressed my phone against my ear while he complained about a client dinner. "You said you would be gone 10 days, he said. "I know what I said." "You always do this. You create a crisis and then expect everyone else to rearrange their lives." Elaine was asleep behind me, her hand curled around the blanket. "I didn't create her heart condition." Richard exhaled sharply. "You're impossible when you get into this martyr mode." He hung up. 2 days later, Daniel called. His tone was too casual. "Mom, Dad said you authorized the new credit facility." "I didn't." "Well, he said you were aware of it." "What credit facility?" There was a pause. Paper rustled on his end. "Nothing major. It's just for expansion." "Daniel, what did he sign?" "I'm not getting in the middle." "You're already in the middle if your name is on the documents." He lowered his voice. "Dad says the firm needs flexibility. I called the firm's controller, who told me she was not permitted to discuss the matter. That had never happened before. I called Richard's executive assistant. She said he was in a meeting with Allison and would return my call. He never did. The following week, Elaine was transferred to rehabilitation. I hired a local care coordinator and booked my flight home. Before I left, she reached for my hand. "You look exhausted," she said. "I'm fine." "You always say that when you're not." I wanted to tell her everything, but the words felt too large for that small hospital room. Instead, I promised to call when I landed. When I arrived at our house that afternoon, the electronic gate opened. The front door did not. My key slid into the lock but would not turn. I tried again. Then I noticed the brass plate beside the door. The lock had been replaced. A black SUV sat in the driveway. I recognized it as Allison's. The letter was taped beneath the doorbell. My name appeared in bold type beneath the name of Richard's divorce attorney. I read it twice. Richard was filing for divorce. He claimed the marriage had been emotionally over for years. He requested exclusive use of the marital residence, temporary control of certain financial accounts, and a restriction preventing me from entering the Bennett and Cole offices without an appointment. There was a second page listing what I could collect from the house: clothing, personal effects, non-essential household items. The house had been purchased with money from my family trust. I stood there holding the letter while a curtain moved upstairs. Someone was watching me. My phone rang. It was Richard. "You got the letter," he said. "I'm standing outside my house." "Our house," he corrected, "for now." "Why were the locks changed?" "Because you've been unstable and unpredictable." I looked at my suitcase. "I was in Pennsylvania with Elaine. That's exactly the kind of emotional behavior I mean. You disappear for weeks, leave business matters unattended, and then act shocked when there are consequences. You changed the locks while I was caring for my sister. I protected the property. Allison is inside." Silence followed, not denial, calculation. Then Richard said, "She's helping me organize the office." "Inside the house?" "You don't get to make accusations when you abandoned your responsibilities." The driveway blurred for a moment. I set my suitcase down before my hand could lose its grip. "Where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" "You'll find somewhere." His voice had no hesitation. That was the part that hurt most. He had already decided my inconvenience was acceptable. I booked a suite at the Hawthorne Hotel downtown. It was not because I wanted luxury. It was because I needed a door that opened when I used my key. At the front desk, the young clerk asked whether I needed help with my luggage. I said no. My hand shook as I signed the registration form, but my voice did not. That evening, Daniel came to the hotel. He stood just inside the suite with his jacket still on. "Mom, Dad says you're making this harder than it has to be." "Did he ask you to come?" "He's worried you'll do something drastic." "Such as?" Daniel looked toward the window. "Interfere with the firm." "I built the financial structure of that firm. Dad built the practice. Your father argued cases. I kept the doors open." His jaw tightened. "You've always needed people to acknowledge what you've done." I placed the divorce letter on the table between us. "Did you know this was coming?" He said nothing. That was the answer. "Your father wants control of the trust-backed accounts," I said. "Those accounts belong to the family. They belong to my family. We're all family. Not when you need something. Then I'm a resource." Daniel flinched, but he did not apologize. Before leaving, he said, "If you freeze the firm's money, people will lose their jobs." "I know. Dad says you won't do that." I watched him walk toward the elevator. "Your father has spent 40 years mistaking my restraint for helplessness," I said. Daniel turned around. I continued quietly. "That mistake is no longer mine to correct." I did not sleep that night. At 4 a.m, I opened the drawer beside the hotel bed and placed the divorce letter inside. Then I opened my laptop. The first document I reviewed was the original trust agreement from 1987. My grandfather had created the Bennett Family Holdings Trust after watching his own business partners lose everything during a recession. He had insisted on independent oversight, clear ownership, and a clause allowing a beneficiary to withdraw operating capital if the funds were being used outside the approved purpose. The clause was dormant because no one had ever needed to use it. Bennett and Cole's operating capital was not owned by Richard. It was leased to the firm through a separate entity controlled by the trust. The arrangement had been drafted to protect the family's assets from business liabilities. For years, I had explained that structure to Richard. For years, he had nodded without listening. At 7 o'clock, I called Helen Ward, the estate attorney who had represented my family since my grandfather's death. She answered on the second ring. Martha? I need to activate Article 9. There was a pause. Are you certain? Yes. Once we begin, the withdrawal cannot be reversed without a new authorization. I understand. Is there immediate danger? I looked at the hotel room's untouched coffee. My husband changed the locks on my home and filed for divorce while I was caring for my sister. He has been moving trust-backed money without my approval. Helen's voice changed. It became precise and professional. Send me the documents. I spent the next 3 hours forwarding account statements, operating agreements, loan notices, emails, and wire confirmations. One transaction caught my attention. Richard had transferred nearly $400,000 from a trust-backed reserve into an account associated with Allison Price. I called Helen. Is this legal? It may be fraud, but we need documentation before making that accusation. Can you include it in the review? I already have. At noon, a second attorney joined the call, Martin Reyes, a specialist in fiduciary disputes. He asked direct questions. Had I authorized the transfers? Had I signed the new credit facility? Had I consented to Richard's use of the house? No, I answered each time. Then we can act. The next morning, I returned to the house with a sheriff's deputy and a locksmith. I was not trying to create a spectacle. I simply needed my medication, my passport, and the documents stored in my study. Richard opened the door wearing a white shirt and no tie. Allison stood behind him. You brought law enforcement? He asked. I brought someone to keep the exchange peaceful. This is my residence. So is mine. Allison folded her arms. This is ridiculous. I looked at her. You're right, it is. That was all I said. Inside, the house looked unfamiliar. My photographs had been removed from the hallway. The framed picture of Daniel's graduation was gone. In its place hung a large abstract painting I had never seen before. Richard followed me upstairs. You have 2 hours, he said. I'll need less. In my study, the trust documents were missing from the locked cabinet. The cabinet itself had been forced open. I photographed the broken hinge. Richard leaned against the doorframe. You're overreacting. Where are the original agreements? I don't know. You were the only other person with access. He shrugged. Maybe you misplaced them. The deputy watched him carefully. I packed my passport, medication, tax records, photographs of my parents, and the small wooden box that had belonged to my grandfather. I left the jewelry, the clothes, and every piece of furniture Richard believed proved he had won. At the hotel, I signed the formal withdrawal authorization. Helen initiated the transfer freeze at 3:18 p.m. Within minutes, all trust-backed operating accounts were placed under administrative hold. No payroll could be released, no vendor payments could be processed, no new loans could be drawn against those assets. I also canceled the automatic payments attached to my personal account: the housekeeper, the landscape company, Richard's private club, the lake house utilities, and Daniel's leased Mercedes. Each cancellation required a confirmation. I saved everyone. Then I called the bank and removed Richard as an authorized user from my grandfather's investment account. I changed the mailing address to a post office box. I created a new email address. I hired a private investigator to document the transfer to Allison. None of it felt dramatic. It felt like turning off lights in rooms I no longer lived in. That evening, Claire called from California. Mom, what did you do? I withdrew trust capital from the firm. Dad says you're destroying the family. Your father changed the locks. He said you left him no choice. I was caring for your aunt. Claire began crying. You can't just freeze everything. What about the employees? I'm not taking their earned wages. I'm preventing further misuse of protected funds. The court can determine what happens next. Dad says you're bitter. Your father has said many things. Are you going to fight him? I'm going to respond to the divorce. I'm not going to fight for a place where I'm treated as an intruder. Claire went quiet. I understood then that my children were not grieving the loss of their parents' marriage. They were grieving the loss of access. After the call, I walked to the hotel window. Below me, traffic moved through the city in red and white streams. I had spent years trying to keep everyone else's life from falling apart. For the first time, I did not reach for a piece of it. The next morning, I packed my suitcase and left the suite. I rented a small furnished cottage near a botanical garden, far from the house and the firm. It had a narrow porch, 2 bedrooms, and a kitchen with old cabinets. The front door stuck slightly when I opened it. I smiled and pushed harder. Inside, there was no marble foyer, no portrait of Richard, no calendar filled with other people's emergencies. I placed my grandfather's wooden box on the windowsill. Then I set my coffee mug beside it. By sunset, the old house was no longer my address. The first call from Bennett and Cole came at 8:06 the next morning. It was from Susan Miller, the firm's controller. Her voice trembled. "Martha, the bank rejected payroll. Have you contacted the trust administrator? They told us the accounts are frozen. Then you need to preserve the payroll records and speak with your employment counsel. Richard says you did this out of spite. I did it because the funds were used without authorization." Susan lowered her voice. "He also says the freeze will be lifted by Friday." "It will not." She was silent. "Can you pay the staff from unrestricted operating revenue?" I asked. "We don't have enough." That was the first truth Richard had hidden from everyone. The firm was not wealthy in the way it appeared. Its polished offices, private events, leased vehicles, and impressive client dinners depended on constant borrowing and the trust-backed reserves I had maintained. Without those reserves, the image could not survive a week. By lunchtime, 3 vendors had sent formal payment demands. The building's management company threatened to terminate the lease. The office supply company stopped deliveries. A court reporter refused to release transcripts until old invoices were paid. Richard called me 6 times. I answered on the 7th. "You have no right to do this," he said. "I have the right under Article 9. You're sabotaging a business you helped build. I am protecting assets you used without authorization. You're going to hurt innocent employees. I warned you for years about the debt structure. You always loved controlling the money." His voice cracked on the last sentence, revealing something underneath the anger: fear. I sat at my kitchen table with my sister's medical bills in front of me. "You should have thought about that before changing the locks," I said. "You're going to regret this." "I already regret staying so long." He hung up. That afternoon, Daniel appeared at the cottage. He had never visited without calling first. He stood on the porch, looking at the small rental house as if it were evidence of my decline. "Mom, Dad needs temporary access to the reserve." "No, it's for payroll. The trust administrator can release properly documented wages after review. That could take weeks. Then the firm needs to operate within its actual means." Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. "Do you understand what you've done? The firm's reputation is collapsing." "Reputation is not the same as solvency. Dad built that reputation. I built the system that paid for it." He looked toward the garden path. "Did you freeze my partnership account too? Your account was funded by the firm. That's not fair. Fair would have been telling me about the credit facility before you signed it." He stared at me. "You knew?" "The documents were in the files. Dad said you approved them. Your father lied." Daniel sat down heavily on the porch step. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and rejected the call. "Who is that?" I asked. "Payroll." "Then answer. They're asking when they'll be paid." He put the phone face down. Before he left, he said, "Allison is saying she never received money from the firm." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "Dad's lawyer found transfers." The unexpected truth surfaced 2 days later. Allison had not merely been Richard's new partner. She had been planning to leave Bennett and Cole and open a competing practice. Richard had moved the money into her account as part of an undisclosed investment, promising her a partnership stake and a financial cushion. When the trust froze the funds, Allison hired her own attorney. Then she gave him copies of Richard's emails. The emails showed Richard telling her that I was too dependent to challenge anything, and that the family trust was basically marital property. In one message he wrote, "Martha will sign whatever we put in front of her once she understands she has nowhere else to go." Helen sent me the messages with a note. "Preserve everything. I read them once." Then I closed the file. The divorce petition had described me as financially dependent. The emails proved Richard had planned to isolate me before making that claim. His attorney filed an emergency motion demanding access to the trust-backed accounts. The judge denied it after reviewing the ownership documents. The court also ordered Richard to produce a full accounting of the firm's expenditures. He had 7 days. On the 4th day, the building's landlord changed the locks on the firm's executive floor because the rent was overdue. Staff members carried boxes through the lobby. Someone posted a photograph online. By evening, local business reporters were asking why a law firm that had hosted million-dollar charity galas could not meet payroll. Richard's name disappeared from a scheduled television interview. The bank called in the credit facility. The lake house went on the market. Daniel returned his Mercedes to the dealership after the lease company sent a notice of default. Claire called from California, furious that her father had stopped paying the monthly transfer he had promised her. "Mom, you have to help," she said. "With what?" "Dad said the money would continue." "I never promised that." "But you have access to the trust." "I have responsibility for the trust." "You're punishing us for what he did." "No, I'm no longer funding what he did." She started crying. "Where are we supposed to go?" "You are an adult, Claire." That sentence felt cold when I said it. It also felt necessary. The next morning, Richard's attorney contacted Helen with a proposal. Richard would withdraw the divorce petition if I restored the accounts and returned to the house. Helen asked whether I wanted to respond. "Yes," I said. "Tell them I'm proceeding with the divorce." Richard had assumed the house was the chain around my neck. He had not understood that the moment he locked me out, he had cut the chain himself. The court later appointed an independent financial examiner. Her report found unauthorized transfers, undisclosed debt, inflated expense accounts, and payments benefiting Allison. It also found that my bookkeeping records were the most accurate financial history the firm possessed. The examiner recommended that I receive reimbursement for trust-funded assets improperly used by Richard. I did not ask for the lake house. I did not ask for his television appearances or his office furniture. I asked for what was legally mine and nothing more. Richard's panic grew visible. He stopped shaving regularly. He sent angry messages at midnight, then apologetic ones before breakfast. "You don't have to destroy me," one said. I replied only once. "You did not need my permission to choose this." After that, I blocked his number and let the attorneys communicate. The divorce took 8 months. Richard kept the house only long enough to sell it. The proceeds were divided according to the court's order, after debts and unauthorized transfers were accounted for. He moved into a condominium near the courthouse. Allison left the firm and testified in the financial review. Bennett and Cole dissolved before the end of the year. The employees received their documented wages through a court-supervised process. Some found new jobs quickly. Others sent me brief notes of thanks. I kept those notes in a kitchen drawer beside the takeout menus. Daniel did not speak to me for 6 months. Claire visited once, but she spent most of the weekend discussing her father's financial problems. When I declined to make another transfer, she left early. I did not chase either child. My sister Elaine recovered enough to return home with daily assistance. I visited her every other weekend. We sat on her porch, sorted old photographs, and argued about whether tomatoes belonged in the refrigerator. "You look different," she said one afternoon. "I'm wearing different glasses." "You know what I mean." I did. My shoulders no longer leaned forward as if bracing for someone else's complaint. I slept through the night. I bought groceries without calculating how much remained for the firm. I joined a walking group at the Botanical Garden and learned the names of 3 women whose lives had nothing to do with Richard Bennett. One Saturday morning, a car stopped outside my cottage. Richard stepped out carrying a manila envelope. I did not invite him inside. We stood near the porch rail while rain tapped against the garden shed. "You look well," he said. "I'm fine." He glanced through the window at the small kitchen. "This place is temporary." "No, the lease is for 2 years." He ignored that. "The firm's assets are being liquidated. I may have an opportunity to rebuild." "I hope you find work that supports you." "I need access to the family investment account." "No, you're still my wife. The divorce was finalized 3 months ago." He looked down at the envelope. "Your attorney is making this unnecessarily difficult." "My attorney is following the judgment." Richard's mouth tightened. "After everything I gave you," I raised one hand. He stopped. "I'm not discussing the marriage on the porch," I said. His eyes narrowed. "You've become very cold." "No," I answered. "I've become unavailable." That was the last conversation we had in person. A month later, Daniel came alone. He brought a cardboard box filled with photographs from the old house. Richard had left them in a storage unit rather than pay the fees. "Mom," he said, holding the box against his chest, "I'm sorry. I stepped aside and let him enter. He placed the photographs on the table. There were pictures from my wedding, Daniel's first birthday, Claire's graduation, and a family vacation at the lake house before the arguments began. "I believe, Dad," Daniel said. "You wanted to." He swallowed. "Are you going to forgive me?" "I'm working on not carrying anger. That's different from giving you back access." He nodded slowly. "I understand." That answer mattered more than an apology would have if he had argued afterward. We drank coffee in silence. When he left, he did not ask for money. It was a small beginning. In the spring, I bought a modest house with a deep back garden. The trust settlement had restored enough money for security, but I chose a place with no gate, no private club membership, and no room that required a staff. I planted tomatoes along the fence. Elaine sent me seeds in an envelope. Claire mailed a birthday card without asking for anything. Some evenings I sat on the porch with coffee and listened to the wind move through the maple trees. The quiet still surprised me. For decades, quiet had meant someone was angry, a bill was overdue, or Richard was waiting for me to fix something. Now quiet was only quiet. One morning, I found an old key in the pocket of a coat I had not worn since the divorce. It belonged to the house Richard had locked me out of. I carried it to the garden gate. For a moment, I held it in my palm, feeling its weight. Then I dropped it into the trash. The tomatoes needed watering. The coffee was getting cold. A bird had built a nest above the porch light, and I wanted to watch until the eggs appeared. So I picked up the hose and turned it on. The water darkened the soil around the young plants. Nothing exploded. No one applauded. Somewhere across town, Richard was living with the consequences of choices he had made confidently and without me. I stood barefoot in the grass, sunlight warming my face. For 38 years, I had mistaken being needed for being loved. At 64, I finally learned the difference. And when the house settled into its evening silence, I locked my own front door from the inside, not because I was afraid someone would throw me out, but because it belonged to me.